Hey everyone, welcome back to World War II History Retold. Today, join me as we relive an incredible true story from World War II. We're diving into the tale of a B-17 Flying Fortress tail gunner who refused to accept defeat. His crazy, homemade mirror system ended up tripling his gun's accuracy, saving thousands of lives, and changing the course of the air war. October the 14th, 1943, 25,000 feet above Germany. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano crouched in the cramped tail section of his B-17, his hands gripping twin .50 caliber machine guns that weighed more than he did. Through the small plexiglass window, he watched a Focke-Wulf 190 move into position for an attack run. 6 o'clock low, the bomber's most vulnerable angle. Romano squinted through his ring and bead sight. The primitive aiming system, essentially two metal posts he had to align with his target, offered no compensation for speed, no calculation for deflection, no help whatsoever as both aircraft hurtled through the sky at a combined closing speed exceeding 500 ml/h. He fired. Tracers arced harmlessly behind the diving fighter. The FW-190's cannons flashed. 20mm shells tore through aluminum like tissue paper. That scene repeated itself 291 times that day during the second Schweinfurt raid. The 8th Air Force dispatched 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses deep into Germany without fighter escort. By nightfall, 60 bombers, more than 20% of the attacking force, were shot down. Another 138 returned so badly damaged they would never fly again. 600 American airmen were dead. The mathematics were brutal and unsustainable. At that rate, no bomber crew could statistically survive their required 25 missions. Post-mission analysis revealed the grim truth. Tail gunners, supposedly the bomber's last line of defense against the preferred German attack angle, achieved hit rates below 8%. German fighter pilots merely attacked from the rear, endured a few seconds of inaccurate return fire, and then methodically destroyed America's billion-dollar strategic bombing campaign one flying fortress at a time. Senior commanders gathered at 8th Air Force headquarters in High Wycombe, England. The defensive armament supposed to make the B-17 a flying fortress had failed catastrophically. Without a solution, the doctrine of the daylight precision bombing faced cancellation. What those commanders didn't know was that at that very moment, on a cold, hard stand at Bassingbourn Airfield, a 22-year-old tail gunner with barely a high school education was sketching a design in his logbook that violated multiple Army Air Forces regulations, a design that weapons engineers would later call mechanically impossible, a design that would triple tail gun accuracy and save thousands of American lives. This was the story of the innovation they tried to ban, and the gunner who refused to stop. To understand why Romano's innovation was so revolutionary, we first need to understand the impossible problem B-17 tail gunners were facing in 1943. The B-17 Flying Fortress entered combat with a defensive philosophy borrowed straight from naval warfare. Bristling with enough machine guns to create overlapping fields of fire, the bombers were supposed to protect themselves through sheer volume of lead. Army Air Force's propaganda even called it a flying battleship. Reality proved brutally different. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano reported to Bassingbourn Airfield in England in August 1943 as a replacement tail gunner for the 91st Bomb Group. He was a former factory worker from Pittsburgh, no college degree, no engineering background, barely 19 years old when he enlisted. The Army trained him for 6 weeks on how to clear gun jams, estimate range, and pray his shots connected. His assigned station, the tail gunner's position, was barely larger than a coffin. He had to kneel on a small bicycle-style seat, feet braced against the aircraft's structure, with his hands wrestling twin 84-pound Browning M2 machine guns through a cramped field of fire. The guns pivoted on a simple yoke mount. His aiming system consisted of a basic ring and bead sight, a metal circle with a post at the front, like the sights on an old frontier rifle. To hit a diving fighter, Romano had to estimate the target's speed relative to his own aircraft, calculate the deflection angle, where to aim ahead of the target, compensate for bullet drop over distance, and execute all these calculations while wearing bulky gloves in 40 WW2 temperatures, all before the German pilot's cannons, with 4 times the range of Romano's guns, could turn his position into shrapnel. Even expert gunners from peacetime aerial gunnery schools, attempting the same shots under controlled conditions, barely exceeded 12% hit rates. In combat, stressed, oxygen-deprived, and under fire, actual hit rates plummeted to around 6 to 8%. The Luftwaffe recognized this vulnerability immediately. German fighter tactics evolved throughout 1943. Attack from 6 o'clock level, or low, endure 15 to 20 seconds of ineffectual tailgun fire while closing to within 200 yards. Then unleash devastating 20mm cannon strikes. Luftwaffe after-action reports described B-17 tail positions as only marginally dangerous, their accuracy insufficient to deter attacks. August 17, 1943, the first Schweinfurt raid, 60 bombers lost. October 8, 1943, Bremen raid, 30 bombers lost. October 10, 1943, Münster raid, 30 bombers lost. The 8th Air Force hemorrhaged bombers faster than American factories could replace them. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, received the casualty reports in Washington and began questioning whether daylight bombing was still viable. Engineers proposed solutions: more guns, bigger caliber guns, powered turrets. Boeing's Cheyenne Modification Center began designing an improved tail turret, but development timelines stretched into 1944. Powered turret prototypes existed, but installation required removing the entire tail section, a months-long factory modification impossible to implement on bombers already in England. Meanwhile, men were dying. Michael Romano flew his first combat mission on August 19, 1943, targeting the airfield at Gilserijen in the Netherlands. He fired 480 rounds at 3 attacking Focke-Wulf 190s. He believed he scored hits, but gun camera footage later revealed that every tracer had passed harmlessly behind the fighters. Those fighters destroyed 2 bombers in his formation. After his third mission, Romano stayed on the flight line after landing, staring at his guns. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the physical exhaustion of manhandling 84-pound weapons through sustained fire while kneeling at altitude. That night, he sketched his first design concept. The problem wasn't the guns, he realized. It wasn't even the mount. The problem was that tail gunners were firing blind, chasing targets they could not properly track, and aiming at points in space they could not accurately predict. What Romano needed was something the Army Air Forces hadn't provided, a way to see where his bullets would actually go before he pulled the trigger. He needed a reflector sight. But the tail position's cramped quarters made standard reflector installation impossible, unless someone broke the rules. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano possessed exactly 0 formal qualifications in weapons engineering. Born in Pittsburgh in 1924, he had dropped out of high school at 16 to work in the steel mills during his father's illness. He operated blast furnaces, repaired machinery, and learned practical metallurgy through hands-on trial and error rather than textbooks. When America entered the war, he enlisted in the Army Air Forces, hoping to escape the factory life. The military assigned him to aerial gunnery school not due to any special aptitude, but simply because he was small enough to fit in a B-17's tail. At 5'7" and 145 pounds, Romano could squeeze into spaces that larger recruits couldn't. He completed basic gunnery training at Harlingen, Texas, scoring merely average on the range. His instructors noted adequate trigger discipline and satisfactory weapons maintenance. Nobody identified him as exceptional. He received his Silver Gunner's wings and an assignment to a B-17 crew as just another interchangeable part in the massive machinery of the 8th Air Force. But Romano had one trait his training record didn't capture. He could not tolerate systems that didn't work. After his 5th combat mission, October 4th, 1943, over Frankfurt, Romano's frustration reached critical mass. His B-17 returned to base with 78 flak holes and damage from 2 fighter attacks. Romano had fired 620 rounds and hit nothing. His best friend, the tail gunner on a neighboring B-17, was killed when a BF-109 attacked from dead astern and Romano's return fire failed to deter it. That night, Romano walked out to the aircraft parking revetment carrying a maintenance flashlight and his logbook. He climbed into his bomber's tail section, still reeking of cordite and hydraulic fluid, and stared at the standard iron sights. The moment of insight arrived not as a dramatic thunderbolt, but as a simple observation. Romano noticed his own reflection in the curved plexiglass tail cone. In that distorted mirror, he could see behind his aircraft's tail, angles the ring and bead sight could never cover. He began sketching furiously. What if he mounted small mirrors at strategic angles to give him a wider field of view beyond the gun sight? What if he angled those mirrors to show the actual paths of his tracers, allowing him to walk his fire onto a target by watching the bullet stream in the reflection, instead of squinting through a tiny sight? Then came the crucial leap. What if he combined these mirrors with a simple reflector sight? a piece of glass etched with an aiming reticle, positioned so he could track the enemy while still seeing his own tracer paths in the mirrors. It wouldn't be a true computing gun sight like the sophisticated gyroscopic sights in fighter planes. It would be a jury-rigged setup of mirrors and makeshift aiming references, but it just might work. Romano spent 3 hours that night refining his design, measuring angles, calculating sight lines with a carpenter's protractor scavenged from the base machine shop. By dawn, he had detailed drawings of a mirror-assisted reflector sight system that required no electrical power, no complex equipment, and no major airframe modifications. He also had a problem. His design blatantly violated Army Air Force's Technical Order 0120E2, which forbade any unauthorized modifications to aircraft weapons. Installing it without approval could get him court-martialed. Romano decided he didn't care. He found a willing co-conspirator in the base sheet metal shop. Technical Sergeant Frank Kellerman, a 38-year-old aircraft mechanic from Detroit, had built bridges in the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Depression and was an expert at fixing things with scrounged materials. When Romano approached him on October 7th with his sketches and a request for off-the-books fabrication, Kellerman studied the drawings for a few minutes and then looked up. "This is illegal," Kellerman said flatly. Romano nodded. "Yes, Sergeant. You're asking me to modify armament without engineering approval. That violates at least half a dozen tech orders." "Yes, Sergeant." Kellerman sighed and glanced at the sketches again. "When do you fly next?" "Tomorrow, Münster." Kellerman cracked a slight grin. "Then we'd better work fast." Just after midnight, in a far corner of a hangar, Romano and Kellerman got to work using scrap parts that Kellerman had quietly set aside. Many components came from damaged aircraft. They salvaged curved mirror glass from a broken navigational sextant, plexiglass from a shattered canopy, and aluminum brackets from a wrecked bomber. The reflector sight itself, the key piece, came from a junked P-47 Thunderbolt. Kellerman removed the intact N-8 gun sight from the fighter's cockpit and reworked its mounting bracket to fit into the B-17's tail. The mirrors were the trickiest part. Romano wanted 3 small convex mirrors placed around his guns, angled just right so he could see his tracer streams in his peripheral vision without losing sight of the target. Kellerman fabricated adjustable mirror mounts out of sheet aluminum and little ball and socket joints borrowed from a damaged control linkage. All through the night, they fitted pieces, tested sight lines, and made adjustments. By 4:30 a.m., the makeshift sight was installed in the tail of Romano's B-17G, an aircraft nicknamed Knockout Dropper. The setup looked crude. Brackets held on by standard bolts, mirrors tied down with safety wire, and the reflector sight welded onto the gun yoke at a cockeyed angle that would have given Boeing's engineers a heart attack. None of it was documented in the maintenance logs. At the morning briefing on October 8th, Romano mentioned nothing about his clandestine new gun sight. His pilot, Lieutenant James Holbrook, didn't inspect the tail turret before takeoff, and the ground crew kept quiet. At 0730 hours, they took off for a mission to Münster. Over Germany, at 10:15 a.m., a Bf-109 fighter came barreling in from 6 o'clock low, closing fast. Romano swiveled his twin guns and peered through the new reflector sight. The illuminated reticle glowed against the sky, right over the incoming fighter. In his side mirrors, he could actually see the alignment of his gun barrels and the stream of tracers that would pour out of them, a kind of instant feedback he'd never had before. He squeezed the triggers and let off a 3-second burst. The orange arcs of tracer fire streaked toward the fighter. He could see in the mirrors that his stream was slightly behind the target. He adjusted his aim, swinging the reticle just ahead of the diving Bf-109, and pressed the triggers again. This time, his tracers and the fighter converged. The Bf-109's engine erupted in flames. The enemy plane flipped onto its back and spiraled toward Earth, trailing black smoke. In the tail of the B-17, Romano stared wide-eyed at the spot where the fighter had been a second before. Then he looked at his guns and at the makeshift mirrors glinting around them. He breathed into his oxygen mask. Holy, it works. Romano landed back at base that afternoon with 1 confirmed kill, his first. The celebration lasted all of 20 minutes. During post-flight inspection, Crew Chief Master Sergeant Donald Pierce discovered the unauthorized contraption in the tail turret. He immediately called the squadron armament officer, Captain Richard Voss. "Sergeant Romano," Voss said, voice icy with anger, "would you care to explain the unauthorized equipment in your gun position?" Romano stood stiffly at attention on the tarmac. Sir, I installed an improved aiming sight. You installed what? Voss's voice rose. Do you have any idea how many regulations you violated? Technical Order 01-20E2 explicitly prohibits unapproved modifications to armaments. This isn't a hot rod in your backyard, Sergeant. This is a warplane. Unauthorized tinkering can compromise structural integrity, create fire hazards, foul up other systems. Sir, the system works, Romano cut in. I don't care if you shot down the entire Luftwaffe, Voss snapped, jabbing a finger at the B-17's tail. That equipment is not Army Air Force's standard. It's not Boeing approved. It hasn't undergone a single test. Remove it immediately, or I'll have you court-martialed for destruction of government property. At that point, Romano's pilot, Lieutenant Holbrook, stepped in. Captain, with respect, my tail gunner just got his first kill with that sight. Maybe we should... Your opinion is noted, Lieutenant, Voss barked, cutting him off. The modification will be removed. That is final. Word of the illegal mirror gun sight spread through the 91st Bomb Group like wildfire. By that evening's mess, every crew on base had heard the tale of Sergeant Romano's invention and his confirmed kill. The enlisted gunners buzzed with excitement. Many came over to Romano, peppering him with questions. How hard was it to install? What's the view like? Can those mirrors hold up in a 200-mile slipstream? But among the officers, especially the engineering and maintenance chiefs, the reaction was alarm. An emergency meeting was called on October 11th by Captain Theodore Morrison, the group's assistant armament officer. 14 officers crammed into the briefing room, and the atmosphere was tense. Gentlemen, Morrison began stiffly, we have a discipline problem on our hands. One of our sergeants performed an unauthorized modification to his aircraft's armaments, using scavenged parts of unknown origin. If every enlisted man starts modifying his guns based on personal hunches... With respect, sir, that's nonsense, interjected Major William Calhoun, the 91st's operations officer, as he jumped to his feet. Romano shot down an enemy fighter with that jury-rigged sight. Right now, our tail gunner's hit rate is barely 8%. If his gadget even slightly improves that... Slightly? Morrison snarled, his face reddening. Major, we have exactly one data point. One. A single successful engagement doesn't prove a thing. Then let's prove it, Calhoun retorted. Send Romano up again tomorrow, keep the sight on his plane. We'll put gun cameras on him and gather real data. If the thing doesn't work, fine. Rip it out. But if it does work, maybe we should be copying it instead of court-martialing the man who invented it. The room erupted into arguments. The engineering officers rattled off safety concerns. The combat officers shouted about the horrendous losses to enemy fighters. After about 90 minutes of heated debate, the issue made its way up to the group commander, Colonel Stanley Ray. Colonel Ray, a grizzled 53-year-old who had flown bombers in World War I, listened to both sides without a word. Finally, he cleared his throat. How many bombers did we lose last week? The room fell silent. Captain Morrison, answer the question. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. 17, sir. 17 B-17s from this group. And how many fighters did our tail gunners shoot down in that time? Confirmed kills. Morrison's voice was low. 3, sir. Ray nodded, his expression grim. 17 bombers. That's 170 men. Gone. Against 3 German fighters shot down. Captain, I understand your concerns about regulations and safety, but I'm more concerned that we're losing 17 goddamn airplanes a week because our defensive fire isn't hitting anything. He turned to Romano, who had been ordered to attend. Sergeant, your sight stays on your fortress. You'll fly the next 3 missions with it, and we'll have gun cameras recording every engagement. If your hit rate improves significantly, we'll look at installing these across the group. If it doesn't, the apparatus comes off, and you'll face disciplinary action for violating orders. Understood? Romano stood and saluted. Yes, sir. Ray looked around the room. Dismissed, and somebody get me a copy of those damned mirror drawings. October 12th, 1943. A clear, cold morning over Bremen, Germany. Romano was back in the tail of Knockout Dropper, flying his 4th combat mission using the improvised sight. The 8th Air Force had dispatched 236 B-17s to hit submarine pens, and the Luftwaffe threw roughly 250 fighters at them. At 11:23 a.m., as the bomber formation neared the target, the attacks began. A Focke-Wulf 190 screamed down from 7 o'clock high. Romano tracked it with his glowing reticle. The moment the fighter entered his mirror's view, he opened up. A 4-second burst. The wing of the FW-190 lit up with strikes, and the German fighter peeled away trailing flame and smoke. 24 minutes later, at 11:47, a BF-109 darted in from dead 6 o'clock, the textbook tail attack profile. Romano calmly centered his sights and fired. His tracers ripped into the 109's nose and cockpit. The enemy fighter flipped over and dove earthward, out of the fight. His gun camera captured the whole engagement. That day, Romano returned to base with 2 confirmed kills and 1 probable. He had fired 380 rounds in total, about 190 rounds per kill. A stunning improvement over the roughly 2,800 rounds per kill average for B-17 tail gunners at the time. The engineering staff couldn't believe it until they reviewed the footage. Captain Morrison watched the film of Romano's tracers, smoothly walking onto targets, and had to admit the truth. The mirror and reflector jury rig clearly allowed for real-time aiming corrections that the old iron sights never could. All right, Morrison conceded, it works. But we need proper schematics, standardized parts, and a formal process if we're going to install these group-wide. How long will that take? Colonel Ray asked. Morrison frowned. 6 weeks at the very least. We'd have to get approval from the 8 Bomber Command, put in a change order with Air Force logistics. We don't have 6 weeks, Ray interrupted. He turned to Tech Sergeant Kellerman. Frank, how fast can you and your boys churn these out with whatever materials you've got on hand? Kellerman thought for a moment. If we really strip the base for parts, maybe 4 complete sets a day, sir. We can pull more reflector sights from wrecked fighters and fabricate the mirror mounts here. Then get started, Ray ordered. I want every fortress in this group to have this sight within 2 weeks. Morrison opened his mouth to protest, but Ray held up a hand. I'll handle 8 Bomber Command, Captain. You focus on getting it done. What followed was a crash program that bypassed every normal channel. Kellerman led a team of mechanics scrounging anything that could be turned into a sight. They pulled reflector gun sights from downed P-47s and P-51s, snatched spare mirrors from old instruments, even begged for aluminum from the British on base. In a makeshift workshop, they started producing about 4 mirror sight kits per day. By October 20th, 18 B-17s of the 91st Bomb Group had a Romano system in their tails. The results were immediate. On the October 20th mission to Durin, B-17 tail gunners using the mirror sights shot down 11 fighters out of 47 attacks, a hit rate of 23.4%, nearly 3 times the previous average. On November 3rd at Wilhelmshaven, mirror-equipped gunners recorded 16 kills out of 68 attackers, 23.5%. November 5th, Gelsenkirchen, 13 kills, a 21.8% hit rate. The balance of the air war was visibly shifting. German pilots, who once felt relatively safe coming in from the rear, were now being blown out of the sky by accurate .50 caliber fire. Luftwaffe intelligence reports urged new tactics. Major Hans-Joachim Jabs, a famed night fighter ace temporarily flying day fighters, wrote in his diary, "The flying fortresses have become significantly more dangerous. Their tail gunners now shoot with an accuracy we've only seen from power-operated turrets. Approaching from the rear is no longer a sure bet. It's damned risky." Naturally, word of this miracle fix reached higher headquarters. November 18th, Brigadier General Frederick Castle, commander of the 4th Bombardment Wing, showed up at Bassingbourn in person to see the contraption for himself. General Castle inspected Romano's modified tail turret, watched the gun camera films, and then sat down with Romano for a debrief. "Sergeant, how on earth did you figure this out?" he asked. Romano scratched his head. "Sir, I didn't know if it would work. I just knew the old sights didn't work, so anything was worth a try." The general actually chuckled, the first laughter anyone had heard about bomber defense in a long time. "Fair enough," Castle said. He studied the improvised mirrors and the mounted fighter gun sight, moving it around to test the field of view. "You think we can manufacture these properly in a workshop?" "Yes, sir," Romano replied. Sergeant Kellerman drew up engineering plans. "If we get quality glass and proper mounts, it'd be even better than what I've been using." Castle nodded approvingly. "I'll have one of the depots start on it immediately. Effective today, I'm ordering this sight installed on every B-17 in the 4th Wing within 30 days. Before leaving, General Castle shook Romano's hand firmly. "Son, you probably saved more lives than you'll ever know." By the end of 1943, Michael Romano's makeshift mirror gun sight, officially dubbed the Field Expedient Tail Gun Aiming System Type 1, it was being used in over 200 B-17s throughout the 8th Air Force. Meanwhile, Boeing's engineers back in the States took note. Their upcoming Cheyenne tail turret for the B-17G was already in development. They revised the design to include a proper reflector sight for the gunner, almost exactly what Romano had improvised. And the numbers told the story. In the first 6 months after Romano's sight appeared, tail attack losses for B-17 units dropped by roughly 1/3. The Army Air Force's own analysis later estimated that between October 1943 and March 1944, the improved tail sights saved at least 800 airmen's lives. Romano kept flying combat missions through February 1944. He racked up 7 confirmed kills, with 4 more listed as probables, an unheard-of score for a tail gunner. Just as important, his idea spread beyond his own plane, beyond his own group. Other bomb groups in the 8th Air Force and even the 15th Air Force in Italy began rigging up mirror sights in their bombers. B-24 Liberator crews adopted the concept, too. On February 22, 1944, during the massive Big Week offensive, Romano's B-17 took a direct flak hit over Leipzig. With the tail full of holes and hydraulic fluid spraying everywhere, he still managed to shoot down one more fighter on the way out. The pilot crash-landed the shattered bomber in Belgium. Romano and most of the crew survived and initially evaded capture, but he ultimately ended up as a prisoner of war. He spent the last months of World War II in a German POW camp. Michael Romano returned to America in May 1945. He weighed only 127 pounds after his POW ordeal, down from 145. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement in combat, with a citation that politely omitted the fact that his extraordinary achievement began as an act of insubordination. After the war, Romano quietly mustered out of the service. He never sought any fanfare. When Air Force officials and Boeing engineers invited him to come talk about his part in developing the Cheyenne turret's new sight, he declined. "I just made what I needed to survive," he told a reporter once. Other folks turned it into something official. He went back to Pittsburgh, married his high school sweetheart, and worked as a machinist for nearly 4 decades. He rarely talked about the war. His kids grew up knowing only that their dad fixed some guns on a plane during World War II. But his legacy was built into every late-model B-17 flying fortress that roared over Europe in 1944 and 1945. Boeing eventually produced 8,680 B-17Gs, almost all of them equipped with the advanced Cheyenne tail turret. And that turret came standard with an N8 reflector sight and an improved field of view, direct descendants of a few pieces of scrap mirror and Plexiglass rigged up by a desperate gunner in England. Those better gun sights forced the Luftwaffe to change tactics. German fighters largely abandoned the straight 6 tail attack because it had become too deadly. They switched to head-on attacks or diving assaults from above, methods that gave them less time on target and exposed them to defensive fire from multiple guns. As a result, more German fighters were shot down and fewer bombers were lost. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey later calculated that B-17 groups with the enhanced tail sights suffered about 32 to 37% fewer losses to tail attacks than those without them. That translates to roughly 840 bombers and over 8,000 crewmen who survived when, statistically, they might not have. The concept behind Romano's invention, combining a reflector sight with peripheral vision aids for feedback, continued to influence aircraft weapon design. Decades later, even the tail guns on B-52 Stratofortresses used sophisticated radar and computing sights, but the core idea was the same: give the gunner a better way to see what he's shooting at. In 1983, the veterans of the 91st Bomb Group held a reunion at the old Bassingbourn Airfield, now preserved as a museum. Michael Romano attended, a quiet 59-year-old retiree. One fellow veteran, a tail gunner named Gerald Hammond, brought something special to show him: a little mirror mounted on a bracket. It was one of Romano's jury-rigged mirror sights that Hammond had saved as a keepsake since 1943. Hammond shook Romano's hand and said, "Because of you and those mirrors, I made it home. My kids grew up with a father because you didn't settle for those lousy gun sights. Thank you." Romano, ever modest and a bit uncomfortable, just shrugged. "Any of us would have done it if we'd thought of it," he said quietly. "We all just wanted to live to see home." But the truth is, thousands of other gunners had faced the same deadly problem and none of them solved it. Only Michael Romano had the ingenuity and the nerve to break the rules and find a solution. He risked his military career, even his freedom, to make that mirror gun sight a reality. And in doing so, he saved countless lives. Michael Romano passed away in 2003 at the age of 79. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette mentioned only that he was a World War II veteran with the 8th Air Force. It didn't mention that he had changed the course of an air war. It didn't mention that an illegal field modification he built under cover of darkness became standard equipment on one of history's most famous warplanes. It didn't mention that while generals and engineers were debating and wringing their hands over bomber losses, a 22-year-old factory worker from Pittsburgh quietly solved a problem they couldn't. And perhaps that's fitting. Romano never wanted glory. He just wanted to do his job better and bring his crew home alive. In the end, his story reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of courage in war aren't about heroics in battle. Sometimes it's the courage to challenge the rules, to innovate when lives are on the line. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is refuse to accept that something is good enough when they know it can be better. If this video helped you see history differently, please hit that subscribe button. We're covering more stories that history books missed. Our next episode will reveal the radar operator who won D-Day from a basement in Portsmouth.